I never expected my life to break open the way it did, but somehow, those broken pieces taught me how to breathe again. I'm telling you this not because I was strong, but because I learned how to stand while shaking. If my voice trembles, let it tremble with truth. I am Helen, and at 62, I never imagined I would speak about my life with this kind of raw honesty. But something in me has shifted, and I can no longer pretend that the silence I carried for years was anything other than a deep loneliness that settled into my days like a quiet shadow I could not shake. I woke each morning in a house that once felt full and warm, but now echoed with memories that pressed against my chest until breathing felt like a deliberate act rather than something natural. I tried to ignore it at first. I made coffee. I watched the same shows. I folded the same blankets. I stared at the same walls as if they would one day offer answers. But nothing changed. The weight inside me only grew heavier, and I began to wonder when exactly loneliness had stopped being a visitor and become a permanent resident in my life. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one afternoon with a book I never opened. I kept running my fingers along the edges of its pages, telling myself I would start reading, that I would find distraction or comfort or anything that felt like a spark. But instead, I just sat there, listening to the ticking clock and feeling my own pulse like it was counting down to something I could not see. That day felt like a turning point, though I did not know it then. I simply knew I could not keep living inside the same hollow routine. I needed something. I needed people. I needed to feel alive again in a way that did not depend on reruns and old habits. The next morning, I walked outside with no clear plan, only a small resolve pushing me forward. I found myself standing in front of the local library, a place I had driven past for years without setting foot inside. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if walking through those doors would change anything, but something in me whispered that it was worth trying. So I stepped inside and felt the air shift around me. The scent of old paper and polished wood wrapped around me like a gentle reminder of a world I had forgotten. People moved quietly between shelves. Soft voices drifted from corners. It felt calm, almost sacred, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I belonged somewhere, even if no one there knew my name. I wandered through aisles until I reached a section filled with stories about people rebuilding their lives. I ran my fingers across the spines and felt a strange ache in my throat, as though my heart recognized itself in the themes of starting over. I sat down with a book and began to read. The words pulled me in so fully that I lost track of time. I remember lifting my head sometime later and noticing an older man sitting across the room with a similar look of quiet reflection. Then I noticed a woman flipping through a magazine and stealing small glances around the room, as if searching for something to hold on to. It struck me that maybe I was not the only one fighting silence. Maybe loneliness was not a private wound after all, but something carried quietly by many people who pretended they were fine. That realization settled into me with unexpected warmth. Over the next few days, I returned to the library again and again. I began recognizing the same faces. I noticed how some of them would choose seats close to others even if they never spoke. Their eyes held the same mix of longing and hesitation I felt in myself. One afternoon, I gathered the courage to smile at the woman I had seen earlier. She smiled back, a little shy, a little relieved. We exchanged a few soft words about our books. It was a simple moment, but inside me it felt like the first crack of sunlight after a long winter. The more time I spent there, the more I felt a quiet urge to do something meaningful with the connection I sensed in that room. I wanted to bring people together, not in a grand or dramatic way, but in a gentle space where no one had to pretend they were fine when they were not. I spoke with one of the librarians, a warm woman with kind eyes, and told her that I wondered if there were others looking for companionship or conversation. She nodded, as though she had been waiting for someone to ask. We talked for almost an hour, and by the end of it, she offered me a small room for gatherings if I ever wanted to start something. I left the library that day with a kind of trembling excitement, unsure if I was brave enough to follow through, but knowing I had to try. I printed a simple notice and pinned it to the community board. It said something like, meeting for anyone who feels alone and wants to share stories or simply sit with others. I did not expect much, maybe one or two people, but the day of the meeting, 7 people showed up, each carrying their own quiet storm. We talked, we laughed softly. Some cried. I listened. They listened. Something shifted in that room, as though invisible threads had begun weaving us together. And in that moment, I realized I was no longer sitting alone with a book and a hollow ache. I was becoming part of something real, something human, something that breathed life back into my days. I had no idea then how far this simple beginning would take us, but for the first time in years, I felt a pulse of hope rising inside me, steady and warm like a promise. I remember walking home after that first meeting with a feeling I had not experienced in a long time. It was a tender mix of nervous energy and quiet pride, almost like the sensation I used to get after accomplishing something small but meaningful. The sky looked different that evening, softer somehow, as if the light itself recognized that something inside me had opened. I kept replaying the conversations we had shared in that little room, the way each person spoke with caution at first, as though the simple act of admitting they felt lonely required more bravery than anyone realized. I could still see the trembling smile of the man who talked about losing his partner and not knowing how to fill the empty hours. I could hear the shaky laughter of the woman who said she had forgotten what it felt like to speak without feeling like an inconvenience. Every face, every word felt like a small confession wrapped in hope. When I reached home, I stood in the entryway for a moment and listened to the familiar silence. It no longer sounded like a reprimand. It sounded like a reminder of where I had been and how far I had begun to move. I placed my bag on the table and made tea, letting the steam curl around me as if comforting me for the courage it had taken to step forward. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling with a strange calmness. Instead of the usual heaviness pressing against my chest, I felt something like anticipation. I wondered if anyone else from that meeting had gone home feeling the same shift. I wondered if they were thinking about the next gathering. I wondered if they had felt the warmth growing in that room, the way I had, like embers catching flame. The next week I arrived early, unsure if the 7 people who had shown up before would return. I arranged a few chairs in a circle and placed a small bowl of wrapped candies in the center. It was a simple gesture, but I wanted the space to feel welcoming. When the door opened and the first person walked in, my heart lifted. Then another arrived, then 2 more. In the end, 11 people came. Their eyes held a familiar vulnerability, but also something new. It looked like relief. It looked like trust. We talked for hours that day. We shared stories about childhood memories, old regrets, quiet triumphs, and the strange ache that comes from feeling invisible in a world that moves too fast. I listened closely, not just to their words, but to the spaces between them. I noticed how their hands moved when they spoke, how their voices softened when they remembered something painful, and how their eyes brightened when someone else understood. Something remarkable happened during those conversations. I began to feel my own loneliness dissolve slowly, like frost melting under gentle sunlight. It was not because I had stopped being alone. It was because I no longer felt isolated in my experience. I was surrounded by people who were navigating the same emotional landscape, each step fragile, yet meaningful. Over the next few weeks, our gathering grew. The librarian would smile whenever she saw us walking into the small room. She often peeked in through the glass window as if watching a garden bloom. Every session became more comfortable. People began to share small pieces of their lives. One man brought a notebook filled with poetry he had written years ago. A woman showed us a painting she had made. Another person talked about their struggles with fear and how even stepping out of the house had felt impossible until recently. Their honesty inspired me. It pushed me to open up in ways I had avoided for years. I shared memories from my own past, moments I had tucked away because they felt too personal or too painful to revisit. I talked about my life before loneliness had taken root. I talked about the things I missed, the people I loved, and the version of myself I thought I had lost. Instead of judgment, I found understanding. Instead of distant nods, I found compassion. There were moments when silence filled the room, but it was a gentle silence, the kind that wraps around you rather than isolates you. It felt like breathing in harmony with others who understood the rhythm of your heart. One afternoon, as we sat together, someone suggested that we should do more than just talk. They said maybe we could read books together, or try activities we had avoided because we felt too old or too alone. The idea sparked something in me. I realized that this group had the potential to become more than a place for conversation. It could become a community, a steady presence in our lives, something that could guide us not only through loneliness, but toward rediscovery. So I proposed that each person choose something they wanted to learn or revisit. It could be something simple like baking a new recipe, or something heartfelt like writing a letter to someone they missed. The room filled with thoughtful silence as everyone considered what they wanted. I watched their faces soften as they allowed themselves to imagine new possibilities. That moment felt profound. It was as if doors were opening inside each of us, doors we had thought were permanently locked. As the meeting ended, I walked out with a sense of purpose that I had not felt in years. It felt like the beginning of something larger than any of us expected. I knew our stories were just starting to intertwine. I knew these people would become threads in the fabric of my days. And for the first time in a long while, I felt grateful for the silence that had once consumed me, because it had led me to this place, to these people, to a version of myself I was only beginning to rediscover. I arrived at the library earlier than usual that week because something inside me felt restless, almost urgent, as if a new chapter of my life was waiting just beyond the door. The familiar quiet greeted me when I stepped inside. It wrapped around me with the same gentle comfort I used to associate with warm blankets on cold nights. I walked toward our small meeting room, touching the backs of chairs as I passed by them, and realized that this place had begun to feel like an extension of my own heart. When I opened the door, I paused, taking in the stillness of the empty room. It felt like a space that held echoes of every story we had shared. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap, letting my thoughts drift through the changes I had felt in myself over the past few weeks. I no longer woke each morning with dread. The silence in my home no longer felt like a heavy reminder of everything I had lost. Now it felt like a space I could fill with new beginnings. As I sat there, I heard the door open. The first person to arrive was the same quiet woman who had once looked so fragile she seemed afraid to take up space. She smiled at me in a way that made her eyes soften. It was a small gesture, but it carried a confidence she did not have before. Soon the others arrived. Each carried something with them: a notebook, a small box, a folded piece of cloth. They walked into the room with a sense of belonging, and I felt something warm settle inside me. When we sat down, I asked if anyone wanted to share what they had chosen as their new beginning. There was a thoughtful pause before the man who wrote poetry lifted his notebook and held it against his chest. He said he wanted to start writing again. He said he felt foolish picking up something he had abandoned years ago. I told him there was nothing foolish about returning to something that once made you feel alive. He lowered his gaze, and I saw the corners of his mouth lift just enough to show gratitude. The woman who loved painting opened her box and pulled out a set of brushes. They looked worn, as if they had seen brighter days. She said she wanted to try painting faces again, even though she feared she had lost her touch. I asked her to show us something when she felt ready. She nodded with a shy pride. One person said they wanted to learn to bake. Another said they wanted to take long walks without feeling afraid of being alone. Someone else said they wanted to start reading again after years of avoiding books because they reminded them of a life that no longer existed. When it was my turn, I felt a tightness in my throat. I had not expected to feel so exposed, but I knew I had to be honest. I said I wanted to learn how to let people in again. I said I wanted to stop hiding behind routines that kept me safe but empty. I said I wanted to reclaim the version of myself that laughed freely and cared deeply without feeling like she would be punished for it. The room fell silent, but it was a silence filled with understanding. No one looked away. No one shifted uncomfortably. Their eyes told me they understood exactly what I meant. After everyone shared their intentions, We spent the rest of the meeting talking about small steps we could take. We planned simple activities, nothing grand, nothing that required more than willingness. A reading circle, a short walk outside, an afternoon of shared baking. As the conversation flowed, I noticed how the tension in people's shoulders softened. Their voices grew steadier. Their gestures became more expressive. It felt like watching flowers open at their own pace. At one point, the quiet woman spoke about how she had spent years convincing herself she did not need anyone. She said she had built walls so high around her heart that even she could not climb over them. She said this group made her realize she did not want to live behind walls anymore. Her voice trembled slightly, but she did not look down. I reached out and gently touched her hand. She squeezed my fingers, and I felt a connection that surprised me. It reminded me that strength often grows from the fragile moments we try to avoid. When the meeting ended, I expected everyone to leave, but no one moved right away. Instead, they lingered, talking in small clusters. I watched them laugh softly, exchange small stories, and offer gentle encouragement. Something about the sight made my chest tighten with emotion. I realized that a shift had happened. We were no longer strangers seeking comfort. We were becoming a community shaped by shared vulnerability. As we finally drifted out of the room together, I walked alongside them, listening to the hum of casual conversation. When I stepped outside, the air felt crisp and bright. I looked at the faces around me and felt something powerful rise inside me. I felt the beginnings of belonging. After we parted ways, I stood outside the library for a moment, letting the breeze brush across my face as if urging me to take a deeper breath. I felt something inside me settle in a way it had not in years. I began walking home with a calm I had never known. With each step, I felt lighter, as if I were shedding memories that had weighed me down for too long. When I reached my house, the silence greeted me again. But this time it felt different. It felt gentle. It felt patient. It felt like a place waiting to be filled with laughter and purpose. I set my bag down, stood in the center of my living room, and closed my eyes. For the first time since loneliness had taken root in my life, I felt that I had taken a real step out of its grasp. I was no longer living in the shadow of my solitude. I was building something new, one gathering at a time, one conversation at a time, one fragile beginning at a time. There was a morning when I felt something new rising inside me, with the same quiet strength that comes when dawn pushes away the last trace of night. I walked toward the park, carrying my tools as I always did, but the moment I stepped onto the grass, I sensed a difference in the air. It was not dramatic or loud. It was a kind of gentle anticipation, the feeling you get when you open a door and know someone has been waiting on the other side. The sky was soft with pale light, and the trees were stirring in a calm breeze that brushed against my face like a familiar hand. I took my usual place near the walkway, kneeling beside the flowers I had planted weeks before, and began pulling away the dry leaves that had gathered there. My hands moved with an ease that came from habit, but my thoughts moved toward something more emotional, a reflection on how far both the park and I had come. I remembered the first day I stepped into this neglected space, how the soil felt dry and forgotten, how the benches looked worn and tired, how even the sunlight had seemed reluctant to settle here. I remembered how deeply lonely I felt in those early mornings when I stood by my window and wondered how many more quiet days I could endure without losing something essential inside myself. Now, as I worked in the fresh morning air, I felt the presence of people around me even before I heard their voices. I felt it in the soft hush of footsteps approaching from different corners of the park. One by one, familiar faces appeared. The same 3 women who had helped me before arrived, with bright smiles and warm greetings. A young man who had recently taken up jogging slowed his pace and asked if I needed help carrying the watering can. A mother pushing a stroller waved at me with an ease that made her feel like an old friend, even though we had exchanged only a handful of words. The park that once held nothing but silence now felt like a living place, filled with traces of laughter, conversations, and shared care. I noticed a little boy crouched near the tree line, studying something in the grass. He called out to me when he spotted a small patch of wildflowers blooming beside a fallen branch. His excitement pulled me toward him, and when I knelt beside him, he told me that the flowers looked like they were smiling. I felt a sudden sting of emotion rise in my throat. Children have a way of seeing life with an honesty adults sometimes forget, and the idea that the flowers could smile made the world feel innocent again for a moment. As the hours passed, the park became livelier. A group of teenagers gathered near the benches, practicing a choreography that made them burst into laughter whenever their steps collided. An older couple walked slowly along the path, stopping to admire the new shrubs I had planted. Two women sat on a picnic blanket, sipping iced tea while talking in soft tones that blended with the sounds of the breeze. I stood back and watched all of it unfold with a kind of quiet awe. I realized that the park no longer felt like something I was trying to rescue. It felt like something that had already been saved. At midday, the three women who often worked beside me joined me near the flower bed. We watered the plants together while talking about ordinary things like recipes, books, and memories from younger years. There was no pressure in the conversation. It flowed easily and naturally, like water finding its way through a stream. Their voices blended with the soft rustling of leaves above us and the distant laughter of children. For a moment, I closed my eyes and simply listened. I felt a peace that came not from silence, but from belonging. Later in the afternoon, I sat alone on the bench near the swings, the same bench where I once sat feeling like an observer rather than a participant in the world around me. Now I felt the complete opposite. The park was alive with movement and sound. The grass shimmered in the sunlight. The swings moved with gentle arcs as children took turns pushing each other. The air smelled of fresh earth and blooming flowers. I let myself breathe in all of it, letting the feeling settle into my chest like a warm memory I knew would never leave me. I began to think about how strange it was that I had not planned any of this. I had stepped into the park because I was lonely, because the silence of my home had grown too deep, and because something inside me whispered that maybe I could bring life back to a forgotten place. I never imagined that by doing so, I would bring life back to myself. I never imagined that others would join me, or that a neglected space would become a gathering place that felt like a second home. I watched as the sky shifted toward the soft colors of late afternoon. Shadows stretched across the grass, while the light grew warmer and gentler. People slowly gathered their things and began heading home. The sounds of the park softened until only a few lingering footsteps and distant voices remained. I stayed seated for a while longer, letting the stillness return. It felt different now, not like loneliness, but like the quiet calm that follows a fulfilling day. I knew that tomorrow I would be back here again. I knew others would come too, and I knew that this place, once forgotten, would continue to grow into something beautiful. As I finally stood to leave, I glanced back at the park one more time. The trees stood tall against the fading light. The flowers I had planted moved gently in the evening breeze. I felt a deep gratitude rise within me, not just for what the park had become, but for what it had returned to my life. I walked home slowly, carrying a sense of purpose that had been missing for far too long. And as I stepped onto my porch, I realized something clear and simple. I had thought I was saving the park, but somewhere along the way, the park had saved me too. I woke that morning with a sense of anticipation that felt almost childlike, a quiet flutter of energy resting just beneath my ribs. It had been years since I experienced that feeling, and as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I tried to understand why it felt so strong. The truth settled into me slowly. I was beginning to look forward to my days again. That thought alone made my throat tighten with emotion. I got up and moved through my home with an ease that had once felt impossible. As I made breakfast, I caught myself placing food on a plate more carefully than usual, as though the simple act of feeding myself had regained meaning. The sunlight filtering through the window warmed my shoulders and made the kitchen glow in a soft golden hue. I stood there for a moment, letting the warmth settle over me, and felt the faint spark of gratitude that had begun to appear in my morning. After eating, I sat with my notebook again. The pages no longer intimidated me. They felt like a place where my thoughts could breathe. I wrote about the changes I had noticed in myself, the subtle ways my heart had begun to open. I wrote about trust, something I had once guarded so fiercely that even I could not access it. As I wrote, I realized how much the group had shaped these shifts in me. They had become more than people I spent time with. They had become mirrors in which I could see forgotten parts of myself. Later that day, I walked to the library for our gathering. The air felt calm and cool, and I inhaled deeply as I approached the building. The moment I stepped through the doors, I felt the familiar sense of belonging wash over me. The librarian greeted me with a warm smile. I smiled back, and something simple but profound settled inside me. This place had become a sanctuary, a space where my loneliness no longer had power over me. When I entered the meeting room, I saw two group members already talking quietly. They looked up when I walked in, and their faces brightened in a way that made me feel genuinely welcomed. I sat with them and asked about their week. They told me small stories about moments that had made them laugh, moments that had made them stop and think, and moments that had made them appreciate the unexpected connections forming in their lives. As more people arrived, the room slowly filled with conversation and gentle energy. It felt like walking into a warm living room rather than a public space. When we began the meeting, I asked if anyone wanted to share progress on the small personal goals we had discussed. The man with the notebook said he had written 2 pages of poetry. His voice trembled slightly when he read a few lines aloud, but as he continued, I noticed his shoulders relax. There was a new steadiness in him, as if speaking his words aloud made them real again. The woman with the paintbrushes had brought a small sketch she had made earlier that week. She passed it around the room, and I watched each person look at it with admiration. Her eyes shimmered when she said she had forgotten how much peace painting brought her. Each story that followed carried its own quiet triumph. A woman talked about baking bread for the first time on her own. Someone else shared that they had taken a long walk without feeling the familiar fear of being alone in public. Another person said they had finished a book and felt proud for staying present long enough to enjoy it. As I listened, I felt something inside me expand, something warm and tender that made my eyes prickle. These were small victories, but they mattered. They mattered deeply. When it was my turn to share, I talked about how writing had begun to feel like returning to an old friend. I said that speaking honestly on the page had softened things in me I did not realize were still hard. I felt myself open in front of them in a way that surprised me, and yet it felt safe. After the sharing ended, we shifted into quiet activities. Some read, some wrote, some simply sat and let the presence of others soothe them. I watched the group and felt a deep sense of connection to each person. At one point, the quiet woman who had once held herself so stiffly came to sit beside me. She placed a gentle hand on my forearm and said softly that she had not felt this peaceful in years. Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke. I looked at her and saw the courage it had taken for her to say that out loud. I covered her hand with mine and told her I understood. When the meeting ended, no one rushed to leave. People gathered their belongings slowly, lingering in small pockets of conversation. I noticed the librarian watching through the glass window again, her expression kind and thoughtful. She waved at us in a subtle gesture of encouragement. As we walked out together, the group drifted toward the front of the building in small clusters. The air outside felt crisp and carried a hint of something sweet, like early blossoms or warm bread from a distant kitchen. I stood among them and listened to their chatter. For a moment, I closed my eyes and absorbed the sound of their voices. It felt like standing in the middle of something sacred. When we finally parted ways, I walked home with a calm heart. The sky above me was a soft shade of blue that seemed to stretch endlessly. I took my time, allowing each step to sink into the ground with ease. I felt grounded. I felt present. When I reached my house, I paused before going inside. I looked at the front door and realized how different it felt to come home now. The house no longer felt like a container for my loneliness. It felt like a place where I returned to rest between moments of connection and growth. I stepped inside and closed the door gently behind me. The quiet greeted me, but it was a companion now rather than an adversary. As I stood there in the stillness, I placed a hand over my heart and whispered something I had not said aloud in years. I whispered that I was proud of myself. Here is part 6, written exactly as you requested. Single paragraph, around 1,000 words, emotional, cinematic, first person female. No gaps, no dashes, no buzzwords. When I walked back into the library that next week, I carried something in my chest that felt both fragile and strong, like a flame cupped between careful hands. And I knew that whatever was unfolding had already stepped beyond anything I planned or expected, and had become something that was shaping me in ways I had not imagined. I had spent the past few days thinking about how quickly this small circle of older adults had become a part of my life, and how their stories had slipped into my quiet moments, like threads weaving themselves into my thoughts. I felt older in some moments and younger in others, as if I were trying to hold pieces of my past and present in the same palm. When I entered the meeting room, the chairs were already arranged the way we had left them, and sunlight streamed across the table where we usually placed books and small treats, and it felt like walking into a warm pocket of safety. The first person to arrive was Ruth, who moved with a kind of soft determination, and she smiled at me as if she had been waiting to share something important. She told me she had gone home after our last meeting, and for the first time in years, had opened the sketchbook she once loved, and she spent an hour drawing her windowsill plants because they reminded her of the morning sunlight she missed. She said this group had made her feel less afraid to try again, and when she spoke those words, something softened behind her eyes, as if she had been carrying an invisible weight for too long. I listened and nodded, and felt a quiet pride bloom inside me, because even though I had not intended to lead anything, I had unknowingly created a place where small sparks were catching fire. Next came Daniel, who always entered with a cautious hope, as if he was testing the ground beneath his own decisions, and he carried a small notebook he had found in a drawer. He said he had started writing memories because talking to the group had reminded him that he had lived through more than loneliness, and he had moments worth keeping. When he handed the notebook to me to look at, the first page had a short memory about a summer evening from his childhood, and the way he had felt when fireflies landed on his hands like tiny floating lamps. The writing was simple and honest, and it made my throat tighten because I could see how much courage it must have taken for him to put those words on paper. Others began to arrive one by one, carrying small stories from their week, and I felt myself growing more attached to this group of people who had once walked into this room as strangers. When everyone settled, we began with a simple check-in, and I listened as they shared the moments that had lifted them or made them feel seen, even if only for a little while. Someone said they had started reading again because watching the rest of us talk about books reminded them how nourishing it felt to escape into a story. Another person said they had walked outside for longer than usual because they felt less afraid of being alone in public spaces now that they had something to look forward to each week. As they spoke, I felt the air in the room thicken with emotion, but not in a heavy way, rather in a warm way, like the room itself was leaning closer to listen. I told them I had been thinking a lot about how easily loneliness can convince us that our lives are shrinking, when in truth, even one connection can stretch us outward again. I spoke honestly about my own quiet nights when I used to sit in my living room and wonder how I had reached an age where silence felt louder than any sound. I said I felt different now because being here made me remember that I was allowed to create something meaningful even at this age, and that I did not have to fade quietly into the background of my own life. A gentle stillness passed among them, and I could see shapes of recognition in their faces, because they too had felt that fear of becoming invisible. After our discussion, we decided to choose a shared project, something simple yet personal that could keep us connected during the week. We agreed each person would bring an object or photo that held an emotional story, and we would share them at the next meeting. The idea sparked excitement in a way I had not expected, and suddenly the room was buzzing with conversation as everyone imagined what they might bring. Before we ended the meeting, I asked if anyone wanted to help plan the next month of activities, and to my surprise, several hands rose. That single moment made my chest tighten with gratitude, because their participation meant they no longer felt like attendees, but like contributors. When the meeting finally wrapped up, people lingered in the room, talking in small clusters, and I watched them with a sense of awe, because these same people had once walked into this room with the weight of isolation pressing on their shoulders. Now they stood together, as if a quiet transformation had begun, without them even noticing. After everyone left, I stayed behind for a few minutes in the silent room and looked at the empty chairs and the faint reflection of sunlight fading from the table. I sat down and took a deep breath and felt tears touch the corner of my eyes, not from sadness, but from the realization that something inside me had awakened. At 62, I had stepped into a new version of myself, one that cared less about what I had lost and more about the community I was building. I walked out of the library with a calm that settled into my bones, and for the first time in years, I felt like my life was expanding in directions I had thought were no longer possible. The following week carried a strange warmth with it, as if the air itself was reminding me to pay attention. And when I walked into the library again, I felt the same gentle pull in my chest that had slowly become familiar. I arrived earlier than usual because I wanted a few minutes alone to prepare the room and steady my thoughts. There was something about arranging the chairs and placing a small vase of flowers on the table that made the space feel welcoming, and I liked the way small touches could soften even the plainest corners. As I moved around the room, I thought about the assignment we had given ourselves to bring an object or memory that held meaning, and I wondered what each person would share. My own object was tucked carefully in my bag, and the thought of showing it made my stomach flutter because it was something deeply personal. Before anyone arrived, I sat down and touched the smooth fabric of the chair beneath me and let myself breathe. I remembered the woman I had been a few months earlier, the one who moved through her home like a quiet shadow and spent evenings trying to ignore the heavy ache of loneliness pressing against her ribs. She had felt so distant then, but in that moment, I realized that she was still a part of me, only now she had softened and grown gentler because she no longer carried the weight alone. The first person to walk in was Daniel, and he greeted me with a smile that held a bright kind of anticipation. He held a small box in his hands and kept glancing down at it as if he was afraid it might slip away. When he sat beside me, he told me he had barely slept the night before because he kept thinking about what his object meant and how he wanted to explain it. His honesty made me smile because I understood exactly what he meant. Soon, Ruth entered with her sketchbook pressed against her chest as if it were a fragile living thing. She gave me a warm nod and took her usual seat, and when she opened the sketchbook slightly, I could see the edge of a drawing she had been working on. Others followed until the room buzzed with soft conversation and gentle laughter. I looked at each face and felt an inexplicable sense of belonging settle over me. When everyone arrived, I suggested we begin and asked if someone wanted to share first. To my surprise, Annie, who usually spoke softly and rarely took the lead, lifted her hand. She stood up and walked to the center of the circle, holding a single photograph that had been worn smooth by time. Her voice trembled at first, but then she spoke with a clarity that made my chest tighten. She talked about the person in the photograph and how that memory had kept her grounded during moments when she felt like she might unravel. As she described the details, her eyes shone in a way I had never seen before, as if she were remembering not just the moment, but the version of herself who had lived it. When she finished, the room fell silent for a breath, then a soft wave of appreciation moved through the group. Next was Daniel. He opened the small box and revealed an old harmonica that gleamed faintly under the room's yellow light. He told us it had belonged to his father, and how he used to sit beside him as a child, listening to the slow, gentle notes drift through the air on quiet evenings. He admitted he had not played it in decades because he was afraid the sound would break him open. But now, he felt ready to hold the memory again. He lifted it to his lips and blew a soft, wavering note that filled the room with something tender and aching, and it made several of us swallow hard. When it was my turn, I hesitated, because even though I had been preparing myself for days, the moment still felt heavier than I expected. I stood slowly and reached into my bag, pulling out a small embroidered cloth that my mother had made when I was young. I had kept it tucked away for years, not because I wanted to forget, but because looking at it always made me feel the sharp edges of nostalgia. I held it up, and the light caught the delicate pattern my mother had stitched by hand. I told them how she used to sew on quiet afternoons, humming softly while I sat beside her pretending to read. I told them how, after she passed, the cloth became a symbol of everything gentle she had given me, and how I had often been afraid that taking it out would stir a sadness I was not ready to face. But now, standing in front of them, I felt a calm settle over me, and I realized that sharing it made it feel lighter. As I spoke, I could see understanding in their eyes, as if they knew exactly what it meant to carry memories that were both comforting and painful. More people shared stories and objects, each one unique and full of emotion. A man held a watch that had stopped years ago, but kept it because it reminded him of a moment he wished he could return to. A woman showed us a recipe card written by her grandmother, stained with age, but still clear enough to read. Another person brought a small wooden bird carved by a friend who had once believed in her more than she believed in herself. Each story layered itself into the room until the air felt full of something that wrapped around us like a soft blanket. When everyone had shared, we sat quietly, sensing the shift that had taken place. Something had deepened among us. We were no longer people who simply met in a library room once a week. We had become witnesses to each other's inner landscapes. When the meeting ended, people lingered again, but this time the conversations were richer and filled with new connections. As I walked home afterward, the evening felt luminous, and the sky stretched above me in a calm, unbroken sweep. I held my mother's cloth in my bag and felt grateful for the gentle unfolding taking place in my life. It amazed me how allowing myself to open even slightly had led to all of this, and I knew deep inside that the woman I was becoming would never again accept a life that felt small or silent. The days leading up to our next gathering felt unusually full, as if my life had begun to expand in small but steady ways, and I found myself noticing details I used to overlook. I noticed how morning light softened the edges of my kitchen counters, and how the steam from my tea curled upward like a slow, quiet dance. I noticed how my reflection in the mirror looked slightly different, not younger, but lighter, as if something heavy had finally slipped from my shoulders. I spent those days thinking about the stories everyone had shared, and how each object had carried its own universe of meaning. It amazed me how people who once walked into the library with guarded expressions now revealed parts of themselves with a kind of brave tenderness. I realized that I too had opened in ways I never expected, and the awareness of that made my chest feel warm whenever I thought about it. When the day of the meeting arrived, I felt almost nervous, which surprised me. I had never been responsible for anything of emotional weight before, at least not in a long time, and the responsibility felt both humbling and strangely empowering. As I walked toward the library, I felt a soft breeze against my face, and I let myself enjoy the sensation of movement, the simple act of walking with purpose. When I entered the building, the familiar scent of old pages and polished wood settled around me like a comforting embrace. I made my way to the room where our group met and found it empty, except for the chairs arranged silently in a circle. I set my bag down and sat quietly for a moment, listening to the faint hum of air through the vents. That small stillness felt grounding, like an inhale before speaking a truth. As people began to arrive, the room filled slowly with voices and gentle smiles. I could sense a deeper familiarity among everyone, as if the thread connecting us had tightened and grown sturdier. Several of them took their seats comfortably, without the hesitation they once carried, and when they greeted each other, I could tell that genuine affection had begun to grow. When the last person settled in, I introduced the idea I had been thinking about all week. I suggested that we spend the day talking about the ways we had changed, even in small ways, since joining the group. I explained that sometimes transformation does not happen all at once, but in tiny shifts we barely notice, until we look back and realize we are no longer the same. They nodded thoughtfully, and after a moment of hesitation, one of the quieter members, named Linda, spoke up. She said she had stopped eating dinner in front of the television and had instead begun sitting at her small dining table, where she lit a candle even when she was alone. She said it made her evenings feel intentional, rather than something she was simply passing through. Hearing her speak with such calm sincerity made my eyes prickle, because I knew how powerful it could be to reclaim even a small part of your daily life. After Linda finished, another member said he had begun stepping outside each morning just to feel fresh air on his skin before starting his day. He said that for a long time he felt like there was no point in marking the beginning of a day, but now he wanted to remind himself that each morning held possibility. The room grew quiet as others reflected on their own shifts. Some shared that they had begun cooking again. Others mentioned reaching out to old friends or allowing themselves to rest without guilt. Each admission felt like a small flame rising in the darkness, and I found myself holding those flames with care. When it was my turn, I spoke honestly. I told them I had begun waking up with a strange sense of anticipation, which was something I had not felt in years. I said my mornings no longer felt empty, and that I looked forward to preparing the room for our gatherings. I admitted that I had even started reading again, not out of distraction, but out of genuine curiosity, something I thought I had lost. As I spoke, I felt a quiet emotion swell in my throat, because naming these changes out loud made them feel real. After we finished sharing, I introduced a new idea, one that had been forming quietly in the back of my mind. I suggested we plan our first community event, not something large or complicated, but a small gathering where we could invite others who might be struggling with loneliness. For a moment, the room fell silent, as if everyone needed time to let the idea settle. Then, one by one, faces brightened. Ruth smiled with her whole expression and said she would love to design small flyers. Daniel offered to bring music, perhaps not the harmonica, but something gentle. Others suggested ideas like simple refreshments or reading short passages aloud. The energy in the room shifted, and suddenly everyone was speaking at once, sharing ideas and possibilities. It felt like watching a field of flowers open under sunlight. I sat back and listened to them, and in that moment, I felt something inside me expand even more. These people, who once walked through life feeling unseen, were now planning something meant to reach others. It felt beautiful, almost sacred in its simplicity. When the meeting wrapped up, no one rushed to leave. People lingered near the doorway and along the walls, talking in small groups and laughing softly. I watched them and felt a deep tenderness settle over me. As I left the library that evening, the sky was washed with a soft, fading light, and the air carried the faint scent of approaching night. I walked slowly, letting each step sink into my awareness, and I realized with a kind of quiet awe that I was no longer moving through life alone. Something had shifted in me so deeply that I knew even if the group ended someday, the version of myself that had emerged would remain. I felt stronger. I felt braver. I felt alive in a way I had not expected to feel again at 62. The week we began planning our small community event felt like stepping into a different rhythm of life, and I noticed how my days carried a new sense of direction, as if something steady had taken root beneath my feet. I woke up earlier than usual and found myself humming softly in the kitchen while making coffee, a habit I had not had in decades. It amazed me how quickly a change in the heart could ripple into the smallest parts of daily life. I spent several mornings thinking through ideas while sitting at my dining table, where the sunlight filtered through the curtains in a soft golden pattern. I wrote notes in a little notebook I had found tucked away in a drawer, and each word felt like a small promise to myself and to the group I cared so deeply about. When the day of our planning meeting arrived, I walked toward the library with a calm excitement pulsing inside me. The path felt familiar yet somehow new, because I no longer felt like someone drifting through her days. I felt like a woman stepping into a chapter she had unknowingly waited for. As soon as I entered the meeting room, I could tell everyone was buzzing with anticipation. Small conversations filled the air, and several people held papers or small lists of ideas. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old books, and it felt warm in a way that was not tied to temperature, but to presence. I greeted everyone and took my seat in the circle, and when I looked around, I saw faces that had once held shadows of loneliness, now shining with purpose. It struck me how transformation does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like older adults leaning forward in their chairs, eager to share thoughts they once believed no one would care to hear. We began by discussing the theme of the event, and after a while, we agreed it should be centered around connection. We wanted to create a space where anyone who walked in would feel immediately welcomed, as if they were stepping into a room full of people who understood the quiet ache of loneliness and were ready to meet it with warmth. Ruth volunteered to design small flyers, and she had already sketched a few ideas in her notebook. She held the pages up, and everyone admired the delicate style of her drawings. Seeing her rediscover her creative talent made my chest swell with pride. Daniel offered to bring soft instrumental music, and another member promised to bake cookies using an old family recipe. Others suggested reading short passages or sharing small, uplifting stories during the event. As each idea surfaced, the room grew brighter with energy, and it amazed me how naturally everyone contributed. It felt as if the group was blossoming in real time, and I felt honored to witness it. As we talked, I noticed subtle changes in the way people carried themselves. Shoulders that had once been tense were now relaxed. Eyes that had once avoided contact now met mine with confidence. Even the silence between conversations felt comfortable. It was a silence filled with ease, rather than hesitation. After we had mapped out the basics of the event, we shifted into a discussion about what connection meant to each of us. One member said connection felt like being seen without having to explain yourself. Another said it felt like having a place to go where people noticed if you did not show up. Someone else said connection was a simple gesture, like someone remembering your favorite tea. When it was my turn, I took a quiet breath and told them that connection to me felt like coming back to life. I admitted that there had been a time when I believed my story had slowed to a stop and that I was just marking time. But now, every meeting reminded me that I still had room to grow and give and build. As I spoke, I felt the room soften, and I knew they understood because they had all felt something similar in their own ways. After the discussion, we spent time organizing tasks and writing down small responsibilities. Several people who once hesitated to speak now volunteered confidently. It was beautiful to witness and made me feel deeply grateful for how far we had come together. When the meeting ended, no one rushed to leave. Instead, small groups formed naturally as people continued talking about ideas or sharing pieces of their personal lives. I watched them with a tenderness I could barely contain. Seeing them support one another so freely made me feel like I was witnessing the beginning of something that would outlive our weekly gathering. As I walked out of the library, the evening sky stretched above me in soft shades of blue and lavender. I walked slowly, absorbing the fullness of the moment. I realized that planning an event was not just about offering something to the community. It was about reclaiming a sense of purpose we had all quietly lost. It was about proving to ourselves that age did not silence our capacity to create beauty. When I reached home, I placed my notebook on the kitchen counter and leaned against it with a long breath. I felt tired, but in the best way possible, the kind of tired that comes from being whole. I poured a cup of tea and sat by the window, letting the cool air brush against my skin. As I watched the streetlights flicker on, I felt a deep gratitude settle inside me. I realized I was not the same woman who once moved through her days feeling invisible. I had stepped into a version of myself who believed in possibilities again, who trusted her voice, who opened her heart even when it felt risky. And as I sat there sipping my tea, I knew that whatever happened next, I would carry this feeling forward like a quiet, steady flame. In the days that followed, I felt a growing sense of anticipation settling into my mornings, as if some quiet part of me had finally awakened and refused to fall back asleep. I would wake before the sun rose and sit at my kitchen table with a warm cup of coffee, feeling its gentle heat spread through my hands while I reviewed the notes for our upcoming event. The thought of gathering people who might be struggling with loneliness filled me with a kind of determined tenderness, because I remembered too clearly what it felt like to move through life without being truly seen. I wanted our event to feel like an open door, a space where someone could step in hesitantly and leave feeling just a little more alive. As the week progressed, our group exchanged ideas through short messages and phone calls, and each conversation reminded me how deeply invested everyone had become. Even the simplest suggestions carried thought and care. Ruth sent me a sketch she had finished for the flyer, and its soft lines seemed to hold a quiet invitation. Daniel told me he had found a piece of music that he believed would set the perfect tone. Others mentioned items they planned to bring or offered to arrive early to help set up. Their enthusiasm warmed me in a way that surprised me, and I found myself smiling at unexpected moments, as if my heart had begun to stretch into new shapes. On the morning of our regular meeting, I left home with extra energy and felt the cool air settle around me as I walked toward the library. The sky was washed with soft clouds, and the gentle light made everything appear clearer, as if the world was being wiped clean and prepared for something meaningful. When I stepped into the library, I was greeted by the familiar scent of aged paper and polished surfaces, and it instantly filled me with a sense of belonging. I reached the meeting room and paused for a moment before turning the handle. I wanted to take in the quiet before the others arrived, because these small, private pauses had become precious to me. When I opened the door, I found two members already inside, chatting softly while arranging chairs. They looked up and smiled warmly, and the simplicity of that moment made my throat tighten, because it reminded me of how far we had come from those early days when everyone carried a fragile caution. Soon the rest of the group began to arrive, and the room filled with gentle laughter and small personal stories from the week. There was something deeply comforting in watching people greet one another with genuine affection. It felt as if the walls of the room held our history and were quietly cheering us on. Once everyone settled, I opened my notebook and walked them through the final outline of our community event. As I spoke, I could feel the energy in the room rising, not in a loud way, but in a steady, focused way, like a river gathering force. We discussed seating layouts and the order of activities and how we wanted people to feel when they first entered the room. I told them that for me, the most important part was creating an atmosphere where no one felt judged or overlooked. I wanted them to walk in and immediately sense warmth and authenticity. The group agreed and offered small adjustments that made our plan even stronger. After the logistics were settled, we shifted into a more personal conversation, almost naturally, as if the planning had opened a door to something more intimate. One member mentioned how amazed she was by the consistency of the group and how it had given her a rhythm she had long been missing. Another said he had begun writing again, not because he felt lonely, but because he felt supported. Someone else admitted that she had looked forward to the event all week because it made her feel useful in a way she thought she no longer could be. Their words moved through me, gently but powerfully, and I felt my eyes sting with emotion. When it was my turn to speak, I took a moment to steady myself. I told them honestly that this group had changed me in ways I had not expected. I admitted that I had spent years believing that the most meaningful parts of my life were behind me, and that loneliness had become a quiet companion I had reluctantly accepted. But that was no longer true. I told them that each meeting made me feel like I was stepping into a new version of myself, someone who was not afraid to care deeply or to be seen. I could feel the room grow still as I spoke, and when I finished, several people nodded with a softness that made my heart expand. We spent the final part of the meeting discussing how we would welcome guests at the event. We wanted each person who walked in to feel gently guided, but never overwhelmed. There was a quiet beauty in watching everyone speak with such care, because it showed how deeply they understood the importance of a warm first impression. When the meeting ended, no one moved for a moment, as if leaving too quickly would disrupt the delicate atmosphere we had created. Eventually, small conversations began, and people drifted toward the door in pairs or small groups. I lingered behind to gather my notes and take a final look at the room. The chairs sat in a loose circle. The air held the faint echo of our laughter, and the soft light filtering through the window seemed to wrap around me like an embrace. As I walked home, the air was cool but gentle, and I found myself breathing deeply as if I needed to savor every moment. My steps were slow, not out of tiredness, but out of gratitude. I felt proud of myself, proud of the group, proud of the way we were shaping something meaningful from the quiet corners of our lives. And as I reached my front door, I realized with a warmth that spread through my whole chest that I was no longer someone merely trying to fill empty days. I was someone building a future, one connection at a time. I woke before sunrise with a strange sense of anticipation pulsing under my ribs, as if something inside me already knew the day would press its weight against me in a way I had not expected. The room felt colder than usual, and I could see my breath hover faintly when I sat up. For a moment, I stayed still and listened to the quiet that seemed to cling to the walls. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel watched by your own thoughts. I rubbed my hands together and tried to bring warmth back into my fingers, and when that did not help, I wrapped my arms around my knees and focused on breathing slowly until the tremble eased. I had barely slept. My dreams had been restless and full of faces I thought I had forgotten, faces that appeared only when something in my life was about to shift again. The memory of them sat with me like a faint ache, not sharp enough to hurt, but impossible to ignore. When the first light curled along the window, I pushed myself out of bed and walked to the small mirror above my dresser. My reflection looked tired but determined, and I found myself studying my eyes the way someone studies a map before a long journey. There was something steadier in them now, something that had not been there months ago when everything inside me felt like loose threads. I brushed my hair back and tied it low, then washed my face with water that was colder than I expected. It shocked me awake in a way that felt honest. I moved through the room gathering the few papers I needed for the day, but my mind kept drifting to the conversation I knew I had to face. It was one I had rehearsed in my head so many times that the words felt worn. Even so, I was not sure how they would land once they left my mouth. The thought made my stomach tighten. I kept telling myself that avoiding it would only stretch the pain further, that speaking my truth was the only way forward. Yet part of me wanted to curl back into bed and pretend the day was not waiting for me at all. I stepped outside and was struck by the crispness of the air. The sky had turned pale, almost silver, and the ground felt firm beneath my shoes. I walked slowly, almost too aware of the sound each step made. Every small detail felt strangely amplified, as if the world had decided to hold my focus in its palm. A few people passed by, but no one looked at me, which somehow added to the sense that I was moving through a day that belonged only to me. My thoughts kept drifting to old memories, the kind that surface when you are standing on the edge of something new. I remembered the first time I had learned how to stand up for myself, how terrified I had been of my own voice, and how surprised I felt when it actually shook the air in my favor. I remembered the afternoons when I forced myself to keep going, even when everything inside me begged to stop. I remembered the version of me who used to hide her doubt behind a polite smile. I wondered what she would think of me now. When I reached the building, I paused at the door and let my breath settle. My heart was beating too fast, and I pressed my hand to my chest almost. Unconsciously, I whispered to myself that courage is usually quiet, that it rarely feels like power. Most of the time, it feels like standing still, even when your legs want to run. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of paper and old dust. The light coming from the windows cast long lines across the floor, and the sound of my footsteps seemed to echo more loudly than usual. I tried not to think about how small I felt standing there. A part of me wanted to turn around and walk back out, but something deeper held me in place. I closed my eyes for a beat and felt the weight of every choice that brought me here settle on my shoulders. When I opened them, I saw him, standing near the corner of the room, sorting through files the way he always did when he was trying to avoid thinking. He looked up with a quick half smile that faded as soon as he saw the expression on my face. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The quiet between us felt like a bridge we were both afraid to step on. I moved closer, and the sound of my own breathing felt uncomfortably loud. He set the file down and rested his hands on the table, as if grounding himself. His eyes searched mine, waiting for me to speak. I forced the words out slowly, even though they felt thick in my throat. I told him I could not keep living in a space that asked me to shrink myself. I told him I was tired of holding the weight of conversations that were never fully said. I told him I needed honesty more than comfort. As each sentence left my mouth, I felt my body tremble, but I kept going. I felt the air shift between us, not violently, but with a quiet certainty that told me nothing would return to the way it had been. He stared at me for a long moment, and his jaw tightened. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the way his thoughts were racing behind them. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft enough that I almost had to lean forward to hear him. He said he never meant to make me feel alone. He said he had been afraid that if he loosened his grip on the way things had been, he would lose the only version of life he understood. His honesty came late, but it was real. I could feel its weight settle inside me like a stone, and even though it hurt, I appreciated the truth of it. We spoke for a long time, sometimes quietly, sometimes with frustration leaking into our voices, but neither of us walked away. When the conversation finally slowed, he looked at me with an expression that felt like a question. I did not answer it. I simply told him I needed time, real time, not the rushed space that people give when they want the problem to disappear quickly. He nodded, even though the gesture seemed heavy. I stepped back and felt the air cool against my skin. When I walked out of the room, the light outside hit me like a sudden opening, wide and bright, and I felt my chest rise with a long breath I did not realize I had been holding. I walked slowly, letting the world settle around me again. My heart still ached, but it also felt steadier, as if speaking out loud had pulled something sharp from inside me. I did not know what the next days would bring. I only knew that I had finally chosen my own voice, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like enough. The morning after everything unfolded, I woke with a strange calm pressing against my ribs. It felt like the air had shifted overnight, as if something inside me had settled into place without asking for permission. The light coming through my window was soft and steady, almost gentle in the way it landed across the sheets. For a long moment, I simply lay there, listening to the slow thud of my heartbeat and letting the silence wrap around me like a thin blanket. There was no rush, no urgency, just a quiet sense that the world had paused long enough for me to catch up to myself. I sat up and rubbed my palms together, feeling the faint warmth build under my skin. My body felt lighter than it had in days, though a soft ache lingered deep in my chest. It was not the sharp pain of regret. It was something closer to the tenderness you feel after pulling out a thorn and realizing the wound still remembers where the pain lived. I stood and crossed the room, touching the edge of the window frame as if anchoring myself. Outside, the sky looked washed clean. Pale colors stretched across it, almost like the world had been repainted while I slept. I opened the window a little wider and let the cool air brush against my face. It carried the faint smell of morning earth and something else I could not name but recognized anyway. It felt like the scent of possibility. My thoughts drifted back to the conversation from the day before. The truth of it still echoed inside me, not bitterly, but with a strange clarity. I did not regret a word. I had spent so much of my life choosing silence to keep peace that I forgot how strong my own voice could be when I trusted it. It felt almost new, like discovering a room inside myself I had never dared to open. I moved through the space, gathering a few things for the day, though I had no defined plan. For once, that uncertainty did not scare me. Instead, it felt like a door with no lock, wide enough for me to step through whenever I was ready. As I prepared a simple cup of tea, I caught my reflection in the glass cupboard door. My hair was slightly tangled, and my eyes still carried the softness of sleep. Yet there was something steadier in my expression. The woman looking back at me did not seem lost. She seemed awake. I carried the tea to the small table by the window and sat with my knees pulled close. I wrapped both hands around the warm cup and let the steam brush my face. A strange feeling rose in me, almost like gratitude, not for the pain or the confusion, but for the chance to finally understand what I needed. I had been walking through my life with expectations that were never mine to hold. For years, I thought strength meant managing everything at once, even the things that drained me. Now, I realized strength sometimes meant letting go and trusting that you will survive the absence. As I finished my tea, I felt a quiet urge to step outside. The world seemed unusually open, as if inviting me to take up space again. I grabbed a light jacket and walked out the door. The air outside felt crisp against my cheeks. The ground was cool beneath my shoes, and the early light cast soft shadows that stretched across the path. I walked without direction, letting my feet guide me more than my thoughts. Every sound around me felt sharper, from the distant chatter of birds to the rustle of leaves shaking loose from a nearby tree. With each step, my breath steadied. I found myself thinking about the girl I once was, the one who constantly tried to outrun her fear of disappointing people. She had always believed she needed permission to choose herself. I wished I could reach back and tell her she never did. As I continued walking, I passed a few familiar faces who nodded politely. I offered small smiles in return. For some reason, those simple exchanges grounded me. There was something comforting in the fact that the world kept moving, even when my own life shifted. It reminded me that change does not isolate you. It places you back into yourself. I reached a small bench tucked beneath a tree and sat down. The bark above me was rough and textured, and the branches formed a loose canopy that filtered the light into delicate patterns. I rested my elbows on my knees and let my thoughts drift freely. I wondered what the next weeks would bring. I wondered whether he would reach out again, and if the space we created between us would lead to clarity or distance. But for once, I realized I did not need to know. The uncertainty no longer felt like a threat. It felt like part of life, the kind that teaches you how to breathe without clinging too tightly to anything or anyone. My attention drifted to a small child running across the path with clumsy excitement. His laughter echoed through the air, bright and unrestrained. His mother followed behind him with tired patience, calling his name softly. The moment felt ordinary, yet strangely beautiful. It reminded me of how simple joy can be when it is not weighted by fear or expectation. As I watched them disappear down the path, I felt something inside me soften. The ache in my chest remained, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt alive. I sat on the bench until the sun climbed higher and warmth brushed lightly across my face. I stood and continued walking, slower this time, as if savoring the quiet unfolding of the day. When I reached home, I felt calm in a way that felt earned. I knew I was not stepping into a perfect conclusion. Life rarely offers those. What it offered me instead was a beginning that belonged entirely to me. I walked back into my room and closed the door gently behind me. The air inside felt different now, not because it had changed, but because I had. I stood in the middle of the room and let a small smile rise from somewhere deep inside. I realized I was finally learning to trust myself, even when the path ahead felt uncertain. I realized I did not need every answer to feel whole. I realized the story of my life was still unfolding, and I was no longer afraid to witness it. As the day settled into a quiet rhythm, I felt a single clear thought form inside my mind. I had not lost anything. I had simply returned to myself. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.